Hey everybody, so here is a little guide to the midterm. And keep in mind, half the midterm is essay questions, and I've already revealed those. So this guide is going to focus on the other half of the midterm. So first off, definitions, right? 28 points of definitions from your textbook, the Van Deeth and so on, and so there are three matching questions, and there are differing numbers of things you have to match in each one. 28 points. Uh, Not going to go too much into this because it's an open book test. Selectorate theory. 9 true false questions. You're going to hate these. Okay, would be my prediction. So let me make sure, though, I've covered the essentials of each one. Get comfortable. This will take a while. Number one. Okay, let's talk about leaders' underlying motivations versus incentives. The theory assumes all leaders want to stay in power, right? This is in a deductive theory, a game theoretic model, you say, all right, this is what people want, right? Because they're assumed to be goal seeking. Leaders want to stay in power. The theory was originally designed, and still, I mean, it still is, it's about the logic of political survival. That was the title of the first book. It's explaining the survival of leaders in office. So the assumption is that the leaders want to stay in power. And that is argued to be a valid assumption that this is the underlying thing, that this is what leaders want. They want to maintain their control on power because it's good to be king or good to be dictator or good to be president. Um, so that is in all systems, whether it's call it large or small coalition, call it democracy or dictatorship, they all have the same underlying motivation. The systems provide them different incentives, right? In a democracy, leaders have one set of incentives, that is to perform well, to provide, because they can't buy off people with private benefits, they have to perform, right? And so they have an incentive to do well. In a small coalition regime, the incentive is to, well, don't worry about performing, worry about providing small private benefits to your small group of essential supporters, right? So that's one thing right there. Loyalty versus disloyalty norms. We have two questions here, right? The loyalty norm, either norm could potentially occur in each system, but we don't see it, right? The the loyalty norm is the norm that you stick to your leader regardless, right? The disloyalty norm is, you don't, right? That you throw them under the bus the first time they screw up, right? And they're based on incentives. The argument is not that people do this because they want to do it or what we normally think of as norms. Um, that is to say that people will be loyal when there is a material incentive for them to be loyal, right? Because all of this theory is about where the material incentives lie for people. And so where there is a loyalty norm or a disloyalty norm, that system provides incentives for followers to behave in accordance with that norm of behavior. So, and what we see is in a small coalition system, the supporters have a incentive to stick with their leader even if the leader does poorly, like say in a war, right? So Putin in his war not going well, small coalition regime, his supporters who are getting these massive private benefits, they're billionaires as a result of being a supporter, they're ride or die, right? They're because they don't care what happens in Ukraine. They're getting their private benefits. In a democracy, You don't have, or a large coalition system, supporters don't have a norm to do that, right? They look at it and say, well, look, you're not performing well, and so I'm not really getting private benefits from you. My I'm getting your performance. And guess what? If I replace you with somebody else who performs better, even if they're not, even if they're somebody else, even if they're the other party, or they're still going to have to run the economy or run the country well, because it's a large coalition regime. You can't target the benefits to one group of people versus another. So if the other if the other leader is better, I benefit. So I have no incentive in it. These are supporters in a large coalition system. They have no incentive to stick to their guy, right? Because the other person could do, if they do better, they'll be better off. So the two systems have these two different norms, right? The norms are defined in and of themselves as loyalty or disloyalty. One loyalty norm is supported and is in equilibrium. It's in people's incentive, have an incentive to obey that norm in the small coalition system, the dictatorship. The disloyalty norm, in the large coalition system, there is an incentive to obey, to follow that. Why keep nominal selector at large? This is a big thing that we a lot of the focus is on, do you have the coalition, the supporters, the essential supporters that are necessary to be in power, right? And in a small coalition regime, there's a small number of them, right? However, there's this thing called the selectorate, the nominal selectorate. These are the people who could be part of your coalition, right? And in different countries, they're different people, right? In a democracy, it's everyone who can vote, right? In the communist system, like in China, it's the membership of the Chinese Communist Party. All of those people could become. I mean, there's a hierarchy, right? They can be part of the different groups, the congresses, and they've got this thing that gets all the way up to the Politburo, which are the actual supporters, right? And all of those people could be part of it. And in China, it's like freaking half the population. It's a huge part of the country is member of the CCP. In monarchies, it's the aristocracy, right? There's certain people that could be a supporter, right? The idea is you could be ruler, but also you could be an essential supporter. You could be in that coalition, right? So the nominal selectorate is this large group of people, and even though the focus is very often on that, the essential supporters, the key coalition, this nominal one is important, especially it's important in a small coalition regime for the leader to have people that they can replace their supporters with, right? So when you have a large nominal selectorate, like China does, any guy, and then, yeah, you have those different groups, right? That funnel up to it, that hierarchy of membership. There's just a constant supply of replacements. I need to replace, it's like, because a big part of a ruler's a dictator or a small coalition regime's leaders, which is, dictators easier to say, a lot of their hold on power or their is, hey, you can be replaced, right? They want to say to their supporters, you can be replaced. And by the way, Saddam Hussein, at one point, he had a Ba'athist party, right? And he had there were, and very often these parties, when you have these party-based authoritarian systems, the party is your selectorate. And there's often like a party congress or legislature. And of course, they rubber stamp everything, but They're that large selectorate. They're the people who are bubbled up and they're being groomed. And Saddam Hussein famously at one point, and this is discussed in the Dictator's Handbook, had whatever his legislature was there, and he identified some guys and took them out and had them shot. I mean, just boom, done. And everyone, yay! Even though they're a little bit worried about being next, as long as they weren't the guy being shot, that meant, that meant that all the benefits that that person had been getting are now up for grabs for everyone else. So, and this is, and you see this, by the way, North Korea has this, right? So sometimes purging people is rather bloody and spectacular. And it is always supported by these people because these other folks want to move up. And you've got to have these. And by the way, I argue that Vladimir Putin has two problems in life, right? One is he's getting old, and he has no successor. There isn't a question about this, but having a successor is very important for staying in power. There has to be some understanding that if you go away, there has to be an understanding in a small coalition regime amongst those essential supporters that if you go away as the leader, they'll still have somebody they can coalesce and they'll keep the same deal they've got now. As long as you have that, and North Korea has been really good about that. That is one of the keys to their survivability. By the way, they do everything right according to the selectorate theory. Large selectorate, and they have this succession. Putin's problem, he doesn't have a successor, right? He also doesn't have a large nominal selectorate. He doesn't even participate in his party anymore. He kind of moved away from the party and it was never essential to him. He's created kind of this aristocracy of people he knows, who he knew coming up, and it's this kind of very personal thing. And so his problem is he doesn't have a large selectorate. So it's going to be harder for him to replace people because who have you got, right? Who have you got that's ready to go? And it's a small and ill-defined pool. And that's, I think, one of Putin's big problems. So that's why you keep the nominal selectorate large. Why does a leader want to control the flow of revenue? Now, all leaders want to do this. It's much more important for a leader in a small coalition regime to do it because that allows them to direct benefits to their supporters. Now, we always remember that misbehaving is often good in a large coalition regime too. Okay. So I don't, honestly, in the question, there won't be a distinction between the two types. It's just leaders want to control it. And it's part of it. All leaders would like to control the flow of revenue. It is not for what is often the stated purpose, right? And that's which is either to make defense things or to, if you're making an argument that, well, by controlling what goes on in the economy, I can make the economy grow, right? Which is often the argument. There are arguments in development theory that a strong state government can control what happens and grow the economy more quickly. There's arguments that China did that. There's arguments that authoritarian rule is better for less developed countries, and there's a debate on this issue. Selectorate theory comes down no, because their leaders want to control the flow to give private benefits, not to make the economy better. Now, in a large coalition regime, leaders do want to make the economy. They have an incentive because of the disloyalty norm that everyone's following their supporters. In a large coalition regime, they need to perform well. But if they could control the flow for private benefits, that would be good too. And so the point is that it's one of the rules in the dictator, rules to govern by, is controlling the flow of revenue is good for staying in office, right? Because you can direct it to your supporters. Much more important in a small coalition regime or dictatorship than in a large coalition regime or democracy. Speaking of the difference between democracies and large coalition regimes, it is one of the insights of selectorate theory is that it's not about a majority, right? Democracies are the concept of a democracy is one person, one vote, and that kind of gets to the liberal nature of these things. Liberal, we often call them liberal democracies. Do we have rights for individuals? Are they fair and equally distributed? That sort of thing. And then the question of whether or not a majority picks, the leader. And that's the democracy part, right? So we have liberal democracy. The point of a large coalition regime, or the thing that makes a large coalition regime large, is not 50% plus one. It is not majoritarian. It is absolute size. It is this practical consideration, perhaps ill-defined and perhaps on a spectrum, right? That when you have, when enough people are needed, that you could not possibly pay them off individually with private benefits, you're a large coalition regime, right? And the point is the United States, and they make this point in the Dictator's Handbook, in the United States, it is possible to become elected president with 35% of the vote, right? Because of the Electoral College, if you assume that you get no vote anywhere else except the places, the theoretical minimum, as long as it's exactly properly distributed, is 35%. Now it's closer to 50-50, although what we've seen is we have seen a succession of presidents, honestly, mostly Republican, who, because they are popular in the smaller states, that have a disproportionate share of votes in the Electoral College. Small states that only have one congressperson, but they have two senators, right? So they get 3 votes, right? That's what skews things a bit, right? And we've seen presidents win with and they don't win the popular vote, right? The point is, though, that for it to be a large, and that's problematic from a democracy theory point of view. From this point of view, though, they say it doesn't matter. 35% of the voters, that's like 100 million people, or that's tens of millions of people, right? Close to 100 million, right? And of course, what do we get? We have like 70, 80 million people voting, right, for president. Actually, when we get turnout involved, right? Still, too many people to pay off. So in democracies versus large coalition regimes, it's not the majority. It's that makes it a large coalition. That's the key thing. Corruption. Speaking of differences between large and small coalition regimes, corruption. In a small coalition regime, it's how it works, right? The corruption's the point. That is how you maintain power, how it works, and it is rife, right? Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in a large coalition regime, because it's still good to pay off your supporters, right? So corruption can occur, and also because democracies tend to be more wealthy. Bueno de Mesquita and Smith argue that it's quite possible that the dollar value of corruption might dwarf that in other, in dictatorships or small coalition regimes, because they tend to be poor, right? And so the dollar value of corruption in a large democracy like the United States could dwarf that of smaller countries, possibly even Russia, although it's so rife in Russia, it's hard to say. But Russia doesn't have a very big economy, and the way they're going, they ain't going to have much bigger economy. So the dollar value of corruption could be higher in a large by the way, this is not the focus of that question, though. The point is, corruption can occur in a large coalition regime. It's just not not nearly as big a proportion of things. And in a small coalition, and by the way, in a large coalition regime, leaders have an incentive to prevent corruption from becoming such a big problem that it stifles economic growth. In a small coalition regime, no, they don't care. They don't care about economic growth. More corruption, the better, right? And so another foible, it's not in the test, but another foible is in small coalition regimes, they can often have very strict anti-corruption laws. And in fact, remember I talked about people being dragged out and shot in the baths, and sometimes in North Korea they'll do this, and sometimes in China they will execute people for corruption, right? So it can be brutal. The point is these dictatorships often have very strict anti-corruption laws because that is a very convenient way of getting rid of somebody. If everybody's corrupt and I've got them all on record being corrupt and I have laws against it, I selectively apply them, and that becomes the reason to get rid of someone. And you frequently see in these regimes that are rife with corruption, they will be kicking people out. And it's not about trying to limit the corruption. It's about culling the herd, about maintaining your supporters, and about maintaining the threat. Hey, I can get rid of you at any time. Don't piss me off. So that's the deal with corruption. And it does exist in the large coalition regimes, democracies, and it can be big in dollar terms, but it's not going to affect the economy, and it's not nearly as central to everything as in a small coalition regime. Finally, debt. In small versus large coalition regimes, there's two things on this, and there was a piece by Alistair Smith that I think may or may not have, at one point there's an article by him on this. They look at the question of debt in small versus large coalition regimes, and what they find is that in small coalition regimes, the dictators, they will run up pretty outrageous debt. Right? They tend to, as a percentage of GDP, rack up larger debts because they can, government debt is revenue they control. And they are able to say, yes, thank you very much. Give us this loan and we will direct this to our country. Now, usually they have stated goals for the loans, but they do a pretty good job of making sure that stuff ends up in the pockets of their supporters. And at the end of the day, the society as a whole has to pay back the loan. And so it's a convenient way of getting this and avoiding, even though a dictator might be really comfortable in power, they do have to maintain a facade. They have to maintain public relations. There is a level. It might be noise, but it might be, you might think of it as friction of ruling, but they do worry about it. And so loans are great. Also, in these poorer countries, it could be a crap ton of money, right? That it's difficult to come by, right? And so these guys love loans, and they don't worry about paying them off because the whole society will have to do it. And if it becomes a drain on the economy, they don't care because their supporters have had the benefit of the loans. This is sometimes called the Commonwealth effect, right? When, hey, my decisions, the outcomes of my decisions will be borne by a group of people. It's like that. So sometimes it comes up. This is rife in a large coalition regime. In a small coalition regime. I hope I've been saying that right this whole time. Oh, God, I hope I've been saying it right this whole time because I'd hate to have to go back and redo the last 24 minutes. In a small coalition regime with a dictator, the loans debt is rife. In a large coalition regime, this still loans, that still goes, right? Again, it's kind of like the corruption. Yeah, there's still that thing of, yeah, it's great because I can definitely, anytime I got something, I can funnel it to my supporters, and yeah, baby, that's good eating. The problem is, in a large coalition regime, a democracy, we have the disloyalty norm going on, right? And if your performance suffers, you'll be kicked out. So you have to make sure that you're not being too greedy, that you aren't getting loans that will encumber your economy, at least in the time span which you will be in charge. And here, this is where the Commonwealth effect does impact democracies, where, hey, look, I'm going to be out of office before the bill comes due, so I don't care, right? That can absolutely apply in a large coalition regime or democracy. So it is a problem, but it's just way more of a problem in a small coalition regime or dictatorship. Okay, so there you go. There are all the things. I know it's 20, we're coming up on 30 minutes. I know it's really long, but I wanted to make sure to not just give you the answers, but to give you the explanations. And these are, I believe I have now told you everything you need to know to deal with those 19 true false questions. And yes, we have just spent 20 minutes on 18%, less than one fifth of, but that one fifth is going to be right. Big part of whether you get an A or a B, so or a C or pass, right? So important safety tip. So that's what we got going on. I hope this has been helpful.